Okay, thank you very much, Dorina, and good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'm glad I got you after your coffee. I can see everybody's perked up a bit from this morning. All right. As Dorina said, I'm going to talk this morning about Africa's governance and its current state of democracy and democratic development. At last month's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the U.S. was able to showcase a whole host of priorities and commitments that it's made to the continent that have been going on for some time. There's the Power Africa initiative, which involves some $300 million per year commitment to enhance power generation on the continent. There's a growing clamor among private investors to engage in Africa, and the U.S. helped leverage some $14 billion in new commitments on the continent. This is in addition to $7 billion of U.S. support for enhancing trade and investment on the continent. There's the Global Health Initiative, which, among other things, focuses on the President's PEPFAR initiative, which the U.S. has been supporting for a decade and providing up to 7 million Africans with antiretroviral drugs. There's the Feed the Future initiative, which combined with a number of food and nutrition activities involves some $10 billion of commitments. And there were two new security initiatives that came out of the summit. There was the Security Governance Initiative and the APREP, the African Peacekeeping Rapid Response Partnership, which are efforts to enhance the capacity of Africa's security forces to deal with problems, crises on the continent. And there's a couple of themes we can draw just from this quick summary of some of the highlights from the summit. The first is that the U.S. has been engaged in a substantive way in Africa across a whole host of sectors for some time. And these are not sort of superficial investments. They're intended to be long-term. They're intended to be capacity building. They're investments. They're investments in Africa and African capacity in the African public sector, so that they can, in turn, provide sustainable benefits for their societies. You know, it's a strategic set of policy engagements that the U.S. has been a part of. And there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, rightfully, for each of these initiatives. Less widely recognized, however, is that each of these long-term initiatives is ultimately dependent on good governance. You know, a long-term investment strategy requires long-term partners. It requires reliable partners on the ground that can see these investments through if you're really going to then generate some of the benefits that are intended. You know, more precisely, it depends on the development of democratic governance. Since historically we've seen democracies tend to provide better security and development. And there's a whole host of statistics we can look at on this. I'm going to highlight a few here in an African context that we've seen that African democracies are much less conflict prone. So of the 21 conflicts that we've seen in Africa since the year 2000, only 5% have been originated in a democratic state. And it bears reminding you that over 90% of all conflicts today in Africa are civil conflicts, are internal, societal-based conflicts. We're not talking about interstate conflicts. So the dynamics within a society are so critical for determining its vulnerability to conflict. And so we see that the form of governance a society has makes a huge difference. Putting this a different way, when we look at which states are fragile, and Africa has 23 states that are deemed to be highly fragile by the State Fragility Index, 2/3 of these are autocracies. And so when we look at conflicts today, whether CAR, Somalia, Sudan, we can easily draw back the linkages to exclusive and limited governance in these societies. And even in cases where we've seen instability in what we call democratizers, countries that have taken steps towards democracy, whether that be northern Mali or northern Nigeria, South Sudan, we see that in those localities, one of the key complaints that people make are that the government doesn't care, the government isn't engaged, the government is corrupt, that the people in those localities feel marginalized. And this is a key grievance that they cite in saying why they would support some sort of armed violence to try to advance their interest. And so, the linkage between poor governance, which often translates into exclusive governance, which often is tied to some sort of ethnic or political categorization or delineation, creates divergences in a society, creates disparities, and this fuels a lot of the internal conflict that we see in Africa. Another key factor with this is corruption. That, again, we've seen a lot of evidence that corruption is a driver in violence in Africa, that it's cited as a key grievance among citizens who feel that the government is exploiting them. And again, it's usually done on an intergroup basis where there's a sense that those in power, representing another group, are taking advantage of other groups who are more marginalized, and therefore the government doesn't represent their interest. And therefore, the only way they're going to protect their interest is to support a violent movement. And the extremist groups that we've seen emerge on the continent have really taken advantage of this narrative, and they've cultivated the narrative. They're starting often with a factual base. There is corruption, there is poor governance in these areas, but they've woven that as a powerful mobilization strategy to gain support for what they're trying to pursue. And so if you look at some of the narratives coming out of Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram, they're constantly talking about bad governance and how the government is against them. And so there's a huge communications dimension to this tension and to the role of governance and security. Flipping it around, and Abu Bakr Shekau in Nigeria, the leader of Boko Haram, is regularly inveighing against democracy. And in almost every time he posts a video, he talks about how bad democracy is for Nigeria and how it has to be fought and it has to be resisted among Nigerians, among Muslims, if they're going to represent their interest. And there's a reason for that. It's because when there is more legitimacy, when people do feel that they can participate, it tends to marginalize these extremist groups. And they realize that their main opportunity for more support is through intimidation, through being able to control the narrative, and in that way enhance their otherwise limited sense of power. Just to put this in context, of course, mitigating conflict is important, since we have seen that once a conflict occurs in a country, it's much more likely to recur. 90% of all conflicts we've seen in the past 30 years were conflicts that are the repeat of earlier versions of these conflicts. So it's relatively rare that we're seeing conflicts emerge in places that haven't had conflicts. Similarly, a conflict in one place affects neighbors. 30% of all conflicts in Africa spill across borders, and so a problem in your neighbor creates instability across the whole region. And this in turn creates various humanitarian assistance problems. 90% of all refugees, internally displaced people, are originating from countries that have autocratic governments and are facing conflict. Okay, and likewise, as I mentioned, democracies tend to do a better job in advancing development. And I mention this because often we talk about conflict in Africa, we have to talk about it in a triad. There's the governance, security, and development link. These three things go together. They reinforce one another. Poor countries are more likely to be in conflict. Poor localities are more likely to be in conflict. These places are also less likely to have good governance. They're more susceptible to being polarized and mobilized by what we call spoilers or militant leaders who will use these grievances to support violent actions against the government. So just to tick off a few of these statistics, economic growth in Africa's democracies has, over the last 20 years, been about 35% more rapid on an annual basis. It also tends to be more consistent over from year to year. So we see less variability. This is important in many poor countries where people are living on the margin. If your incomes are going to fluctuate by 40% in a year and you're just eking by as it is, you're much more vulnerable in a highly volatile situation. So countries like Ghana, Mauritius, Benin, Botswana, they have tended to consistently do better than countries like Cameroon, Chad, Republic of Congo, Swaziland, and others. This also translates into social benefits. Life expectancies in countries that are democratic have, on average in Africa, been about 10 years longer than in autocracies. Infant mortality rates about 40% lower. Opportunities of attending school, especially secondary school, are greater, about 40%. And cereal yields are on average about 20% higher. This is important since still some 60-70% of African populations earn their incomes through rural livelihoods. And so better agricultural production means more jobs. So democracy contributes to security in a variety of reasons, both direct and indirect. And it really builds on the sense that democracies have incentives to be and show interest in public priorities. They have incentives to invest in their people, to strengthen social delivery opportunities, create jobs. There are incentives for democracies to be more transparent, which mitigates corruption. So there's a host of things that we can unpack as to why these linkages play out. I think the key point here is that when we talk about democracy in Africa, we often think of it as another goal out there. It's a parallel objective, when in fact it's a cornerstone to a lot of the other things that we're talking about, both in the security and development front, and linked to all the initiatives that were highlighted in the summit last month. Okay, so what is the state of Africa's democracy today? And I think to answer that question, we need to look at this from a historical perspective, that Africa started from a very low point in its democratic progress. At the end of the Cold War, there were only 2 African countries that could be considered democracies. And that number has slowly inched forward in the 2 decades since then. More dramatically, we've seen a decline in the number of pure autocracies over that last couple of decades. So there's no governments that are declared one-party state anymore. That's not to say that there aren't still de facto one-party states. There has been just a much greater openness to multipartyism, some recognition for a need for civil society, press freedoms, freedom of movement, and that sort of thing. And so there has been significant change over the last couple of decades. As this slide using Freedom House data shows, however, the pace of progress has slowed in the last decade. So the blue pillars on the chart are the growth of democracies, and we can see between 2003, 2013, there hasn't been much advance. It's in fact gone down a little bit. Likewise, the gray or brown pillars there represent the decline in autocracies, and while they've made a dramatic decline this past decade, there's probably been a bumping up of the number of autocracies on the continent. And all the while, we've seen expansion in the number of intermediate or mixed regimes that are out there. And so when we talk about Africa's governance or progress towards democracy, we need to talk about the variance in Africa's governance. There's a huge range, there's a spectrum that's been realized out there. Up to this point, there's about 10 out of 54 countries that we consider democracies, so just about 20%. There's another 24 countries that are what we call democratizing. They're moving onto the path of democracy, though they haven't really established the sufficient institutional capacity and checks and balances, mechanisms for sheer power to make them genuine democracies. Moving to the right side of the ledger, we have another group we call semi-authoritarians. These are governments that have adopted some of the trappings, some of the external fixtures of democracy. They'll hold elections, for example, but they're not really free and fair. They allow other political parties, but they don't necessarily let them campaign freely. So, they're trying to use the appeal of democracy without really giving up power. And then the column on the far right are the remaining pure autocracies, which, again, amount to about 8 to 10 countries that are still out there. So a lot of, there's been change. It's an ongoing process. There's a lot of variance. I think another factor to keep in mind is the experience with democratization in Africa is also prone to backsliding. So these aren't linear paths of progression we see. In fact, 65% of all African countries that have started down the path for democracy have experienced at least one period of backsliding. Yet, 2/3 of those that backslide actually then resume a forward path, within 3 years time period. So I think Mali might be a good example. It had been on a democratic path for 20 years. It had a coup in 2012. People were forlorn that this example of democracy had disintegrated. There were a lot of bumps along that road, but within 2 years, they were able to have elections and reconstitute a democratic-leaning government. I wouldn't consider it a democratic government, but it's back on a democratizing path, and will no doubt be drawing on some of the experiences that it had over that previous period of time. So important lessons that it's a long-term process, it's bumpy, it's back and forth. Just because a country has fallen back, it doesn't mean that's the end of the story. there are opportunities for recovery. And likewise, just because a country is currently considered a democracy doesn't mean that it's a consolidated democracy. Doesn't mean it's necessarily grounded in all of its institutions. And so, we've seen a couple of cases in this past year, Lesotho being a good one, where the president tried to dismiss the defense chief of staff, who didn't want to leave, and so he had threatened to take control of the government, and so there were a couple of days where there was uncertainty about where that was going. Finally, they were able to reestablish control, but I think the point being, the process of consolidation takes time. It takes decades, and we shouldn't assume that just because a country has a good track record that it is always going to be that way. These things have to be continually nurtured and strengthened. And again, because Africa is starting from a low starting point, it probably is going to take longer than we want it to take. And I think we have to adapt our expectations on that over time. And so as we think about governance in Africa, I think it's helpful to recognize that there's a battle going on. There's a battle for norms of what Africa's governance is going to look like. And there are pressures in both directions. And the outcome isn't known. And so I think that's where we come into it, and that's where we'll be engaging moving forward. So in the remaining of my time, I want to sort of review what some of these pressures are, what I think some of the most critical pressures are, pushing back and then moving forward. Some of the factors constraining democratization on the continent. Well, the one I would highlight first off is what people call a big man legacy. This is the idea that in many African political systems, they're very highly personalistic. They're dependent on a single individual who represents power. He is above the law. He applies the law. And in a weak institutional environment, he has great authority over policies and resources of the state. These governance structures are often highly patronage-based. So he is able to reward friends and allies with the riches from the state, and in that way reinforce his power structure. But this is often, I think by definition, this is an exclusionary governance structure. It's often broken down by ethnic group or political party or geographic region. And so it creates divergences and greater inequities and disparities within society, which fuels grievances and leads to greater instability. Indicatively, there are some 17 African heads of state that have been in power for more than a decade at this point. And that's what the picture on the top left represents, the leader of Equatorial Guinea, who has been in power, I believe, 41 years now. So that concentration of power in the head of state continues to be a big problem. Another factor I would throw out is weak national identity. We need to remember that nearly every African country was artificially created in the colonial era, and people don't have a natural affinity with the often multiple ethnic groupings that are comprised within a single national jurisdiction. And so there's an ongoing process of developing this identity. It's happening at greater paces in some places than others, but often, there's a stronger allegiance to one's ethnic group than there is to the national identity, and that inhibits democratic development. Another factor is corruption. Again, and this is important often from a governance standpoint because it's linked to official corruption, which creates these disparities, it inhibits growth, and it leads to instability. but of within Transparency's annual corruption perception index of 177 countries, 24 African countries show up in the bottom quintile of that list. So corruption continues to be a big problem, and it causes people to lose confidence in their government leaders. In fact, the World Economic Forum did a study in the past year that claims that there's more revenue leaving Africa through illicit outflows than is coming in through foreign assistance and foreign direct investment from the private sector. So, a key challenge. This is often tied up with natural resource wealth, the so-called natural resource curse, that the paradox that you have countries with natural resource wealth that end up actually doing less well economically, have higher levels of corruption, and have higher levels of autocracy. In fact, over half of all natural resource rich countries in Africa have autocratic governments. It's not a coincidence. Having access to that wealth allows them more resiliency to stay in power. They're able to feed their patronage networks to a greater extent, and in that way, pay for the security forces that they need that tend to be more loyal to the individual in charge, the big man, rather than to the state. And I think that would be another factor that I would throw out, the lack of professionalism in the security sector. You do have these alliances between political leaders and military leaders, and we see this especially among presidential guards, which aren't sort of small elite units, but they end up being 20,000 man units that are personally responsible to the president, and they are commanded and trained and supplied completely differently from your standing army, so it creates differences within the security forces in these societies, and again provides a protection force for these leaders within their societies. On this point, and with regard to the concern about coups, there was a couple years ago a spate of coups we saw. Niger, Mali, Madagascar, Mauritania all had coups within a period of a couple of years, and there was a worry that we're seeing a return of the coup in Africa. If you look at this historically over the last 30 years, in fact, coups have dwindled dramatically from what we saw in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, and so they are an aberration these days. Nonetheless, the broader point about the politicization of the military continues, and the dividing lines between politics and security are pretty blurry in a lot of places. And harkening back to the point on patronage, that often also includes the security sector, and so it inhibits again this evolution towards democratic progress, both from a direct intervention from the militaries as well as for protecting their political allies. Another point I would throw out, and I think important to be mindful of, is the growing influence of narcotics traffickers. That as more money comes into this trade, the traffickers are very purposely trying to co-opt politicians to provide them support and cover. They would prefer not to face any resistance and have to encounter any fighting to maintain their trafficking pathways. So it's much easier just to buy off these leaders. And unfortunately, both on the political and the security side, it's been all too easy to do so in many African countries. But this in turn is weakening democratic and other governance structures in many countries in West and East Africa. Last point I would throw out is just it takes time to consolidate democratic institutions. I would just reinforce that these are decades-long processes. Important gains can be made in a period of years, but to sustain those gains, it takes a longer period of time. And so needing to keep the eye on the ball and keep pushing it forward. Let me walk through some of the positive measures, and then I know Dorina wants me to sit down and we can open up for some discussion. But just to go over a couple of positive trends. In the process of the democratization that we've seen over the last couple of decades, we've also seen some growing institutionalization. And Dorina mentioned that in her opening remarks. There is progress in this area, and we see it in terms of strengthened parliaments or legislatures who are doing a better job of providing a buffer and check and balance in some of the heads of state. There have been cases in the last couple of years between Uganda and Tanzania where parliaments actually stood up to the chief executive and demanded more explanation, demanded more transparency for contracts with regards to natural resource extraction in those societies. We're seeing this in terms of election management bodies. Africa now holds between 17, 20 elections, national elections every year. So it's becoming routinized, and the quality of these elections is becoming better. They're more professional election management bodies, and so there's going to be more credibility and legitimacy in the electoral processes. We're seeing similar gains in terms of courts, local governments, that are all slowly helping to diffuse power from the consolidated hold within the executive branch that has historically been has been the case. I would also point out the importance of media and civil society. The last couple of decades, we've seen growing independence of media. In Africa, radio continues to be highly important. Since year 2000, we've seen hundreds of new community radio stations. In fact, it's increased 1,300%. And so there are now more channels of access to information on the continent. Civil society groups have grown more effective, more organized. This is facilitating greater dialogue within societies and helping for them to advocate for the interest of the public. In the recent constitutional reform process in Kenya, it was civil society that really took the lead in making that a reality. In Nigeria's struggle to move towards democracy, it's civil society that is often the one championing reforms, trying to hold the government accountable, trying to make sure the election process becomes more transparent. So those two institutional developments, I think, are particularly important. Something that a lot of people are talking about is the growth of ICT, information communications technology. There's been an explosion in access to information in Africa over the last decade, especially. There are now I think 60% of all adults have access to a mobile phone. This is compared to less than 5% in the early 2000s. There's over 55 million Facebook users in Africa, nearly 200 million internet users. And the internet transmission capacity in Africa has improved tenfold just in the last 4 years because of technological advances there. So it's changing the ball game in terms of how people get access to information, and this in turn is changing the dynamics between societies and their governments in terms of what they're demanding, in terms of what they know, and how they relate. There are other factors, a stronger private sector, growing and more educated youth. You talked yesterday about stronger regional norms, including for stronger democratization. These are all works in progress. They certainly aren't complete, but there are positive trajectories that are unfolding. There's a momentum that is pushing back against the pushback to constrain democratization. And so, we'll see where this goes from here. I don't think the outcome is a certainty. But recognizing that, I think, is particularly important for how we engage the continent, and realizing that so much of what we are trying to accomplish is going to depend on realizing stable democratic governance processes on the continent. And so, to leave you, I would just throw out a couple of final takeaways. That we have this historic struggle going on, which has major implications for what we do on the security front. That because of the long-term nature of a lot of U.S. Engagements on the continent, it relies on having stable partners. You can't pursue these initiatives in the abstract. They have to have people who are committed to these principles on the ground. That progress has been checkered up to this point, and it is a long-term process, and there are competing forces pushing in both directions, and so just to recognize and be aware of that. And finally, just to recognize that there are external forces involved too. That I talked about the narcotics traffickers. I didn't bring out, in terms of the natural resource sector, you often have, international firms, sometimes state-supported firms, who, once they've established a privileged position vis-a-vis a government, they don't want to let that erode. And so if that government comes under pressure, they're quick to provide resources, funding, arms, and other means to keep them in power. And so that is one of the inhibiting factors that we've seen for democratization progress here in the last decade. So let me stop there. Thanks for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.